Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. I'm really excited to bring you today's video. If you enjoy my content, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Let's get started. The vast forests of Siberia are one of the places that best show how ruthless nature can be. That day, as autumn was coming to an end, the weather suddenly turned cold, and by the early hours of the morning, a snowstorm seemed imminent. Ivan was not one of the old hunters lost in the depths of the forest. But that day, he decided to follow his instincts and venture farther from his village in search of more game. He was alone. Truly alone. He had planned to pass through part of the forest before the storm hit, but unfortunately his plans didn't work out. As he began his journey in the early hours, the landscape around him changed rapidly. The sky became covered with gray clouds, and the wind blew fiercely. The snowstorm, which started slowly and calmly, soon covered everything with a white blanket within minutes. The trees around him disappeared, leaving only snow and darkness. When he realized he had lost his way, it was too late to turn back. As time passed, the snowstorm intensified and everything became completely white, with deep snowdrifts swallowing his footprints instantly. Ivan tried to remember the old maps and navigation techniques to find his way, but his mind started to grow foggy. The snowstorm had erased any signs, and even the trees had vanished like mere shadows. All that remained was the howling wind and the hum of the snow. Being alone in the harsh wilderness of Siberia was a situation where everything required for survival was put to the test. Ivan's solitude in this environment was turning deadly. The fear quickly rising in his mind increased with every passing minute. Despite his experience in hunting and surviving in nature, when the storm grew this rapidly, even the most reliable knowledge seemed insufficient. Sometimes, no matter how prepared you are, nature can be powerful enough to break your will. Right now, Ivan was just a stranger to the natural world. In a place ruled by trees, wind, and snow, he was a foreigner. As hours passed, the cold began to grip his body. His thick clothes slowly became damp, and they were no longer enough to protect him from the harsh weather. His mind raced with survival. Thoughts mingled with the growing fear of being lost. The loneliness that came with being lost was combined with a growing sense of emptiness. The snowstorm had intensified so much that it became nearly impossible to move forward. After a while, Ivan raised his head to listen to the silence of nature. All he could hear was the wind, and occasionally, the sound of the snow cracking. There were no sounds, no signs of life around him. Every step he took seemed to erase the traces of the past in the snow-covered world. Ivan realized something. He was now at the mercy of nature, and nothing, no maps, no past experiences, and no determination, could save him from this snowy labyrinth. As the hours went on, he continued to move, carefully watching the footprints he had left in the snow. But each step only led him deeper into loneliness. And then he realized that there was no animal to hunt and no way out. In that moment, he was truly lost. When Ivan realized he was lost, he didn't panic at first. With an inner calm, he tried to accept the difficult situation he was in. This was a moment that made him trust his survival instincts. Years of hunting experience had taught him how to deal with nature. The thick hunting clothes he wore, his leather boots, and his rifle were the basic tools for short-term survival, but soon these would start to fall short. At first, the cold was only uncomfortable. However, when the snowstorm stopped, that cold began to envelop his body. The deep snow was becoming an obstacle that made every step harder. His feet, even in his boots, were sinking into the snow. As the night approached and temperatures dropped below zero, even sleeping became a serious risk. For a while he tried to warm himself by walking, but the cold continued to tighten around him, freezing his muscles. Finding food quickly became a serious issue. During the first few hours, he didn't spend too much time hunting, but by the time evening came, if he didn't find something, he would spend the night hungry. The forest around him was silent due to the heavy snow and darkness. He knew that the best time to hunt was in the early morning, but right now, every hour was a fight for survival. He had pushed himself deep into the forest, his hair standing on end as he found a squirrel's track. Moving quietly, he began to follow it. For hours, Ivan followed the squirrel tracks. He heard nothing except the sound of the wind, the creaking, and the rustling of the trees. His mind was carefully analyzing every movement in nature, and he was making each step with precise calculation. At a point where the squirrel tracks became clearer, he pulled out his rifle and quietly began closing the distance between himself and the squirrel. Finally, when he held the body of the squirrel in his hands, the feeling of victory was replaced by disappointment. Such a small prey was not enough for all this effort, yet finding food was the most important step for survival at that moment. His body was severely freezing, and he felt an urgent need to make a fire. The squirrel would perhaps be the most important resource for his survival, but it was so insufficient that every bite felt like a sip of warmth. His body was malnourished from the game's meat, and it kept growing colder. Slowly, he took steps backward, trying to clear an area. Searching for a shelter to spend the night, he gathered a few branches, but the conditions here weren't helping him at all. A few simple twigs would not provide him with any warmth. He managed to start a fire, but it was so weak that even seeing the flames couldn't prevent his body from freezing. Holding his hands over the fire, he tried to warm up, but with every passing hour, his body became more strained. There was no game to be found around him, and there was no place to survive. The animals around him seemed to have vanished in the depth of winter. By the end of the first day, as darkness fell, Ivan was still lost in the snow-covered forest. While his hunting and survival skills had taken him a step further, even those abilities were starting to fall short in the face of nature's power. He paused for a moment, closed his eyes, and took a deep breath. He knew that everything could pass, that with determination, he could survive. But this didn't mean that he would overcome nature's hardships and that all his efforts would be rewarded. The second week became the hardest period of Ivan's survival struggle. At first, he had realized he was lost, accepting himself as a lost hunter. However, as time passed, nature's harshness created a void inside him. His body felt more and more fatigued every day, and moving through the snow-covered terrain was becoming increasingly difficult. With every step, he sank deeper into the snow, and with each step in his boots, he had to exert more effort. In the freezing cold of winter, every step, every breath turned into a new battle. Hunting was not as easy as he initially thought. The excitement of the first few days and his survival instincts had given him some advantage. But things had changed over time. Small game, like squirrels, had become so rare that he had no choice but to chase them whenever the opportunity arose. However, as time went on, he felt as though all the animals he could hunt had vanished. Adding even a little meat to his life would be a critical step to survival. But the snow around him was only a cold blanket. For several days, he found nothing. He began to feel lonely in this silent, empty world covered in snow. Plants might have given him some strength. Tree roots, moss, edible herbs. He spent hours each day searching for them. But with each passing day, his body grew weaker, his muscles were depleted, and every part of him was frozen by the cold. This was not only physical exhaustion, but also a mental battle. He tried to trust his survival instincts, but he was gradually losing strength. The weight loss had rapidly decreased his body's energy levels. At night, the cold was so intense that the hours he spent in his shelter turned into a fight to protect his body. He couldn't sleep. He always felt like there was a threat. However, one morning, after a night where he heard the wind's strength, he took a deep breath to keep from losing hope. He was waiting for something to change. In that moment, his instincts urged him into action. After the wind settled, he noticed almost invisible movement in the snow. He carefully turned his eyes, and within seconds, he saw the snow hare. The hare was hidden in the snow, but it was there so close. Slowly, he pulled out his rifle and held his breath, waiting for a few seconds. Every muscle in his body tensed, as if slowing down time. A few minutes passed, and the hare got up and began to move quietly. Even, determined not to miss the opportunity, made every move cautiously. The first shot from his rifle echoed in the darkness. After taking a few steps, the hare collapsed to the ground. Even approached his prey with a mixed feeling of victory. In that moment, despite the silence around him, the cold of the snow, and his exhaustion, He took a breath. Looking back, Ivan felt a sense of gratitude toward the rabbit before he left it on the ground. Achieving this meant finding a source of food that would keep him alive for a few more days. His body was still weak, but this small prey gave him the strength to survive. As he prepared the meat, cooking the rabbit he had caught with his rifle over the fire, he finally began to warm up. His body regained some strength from the nutrients in the rabbit's meat. At first, he warmed up slowly and carefully, and the emptiness inside him started to fill. However, the endless hunger and cold that had lasted for days continued to test his mental resilience. This hunt was just another step toward survival, but the harshness of nature still reminded him of how powerful it was. As he slowly continued eating, Ivan clung to a small glimmer of hope. With each passing day, the struggle for survival became more real, and he felt he could do just a bit more. There was only one thing left to do: face nature's cold and ruthless face and survive. By the end of the third week, the fatigue in Ivan's body began to turn into a mental collapse. Loneliness, cold, and hunger combined to create an ever-growing emptiness inside him. As the days passed, the laughter and conversations of people, the reassuring feeling of hearing someone's voice, seemed like a distant dream. He started talking to himself, whispering words to maintain his mental health. His mind, suddenly faced with an existential crisis beyond survival, was overwhelmed. Unable to communicate with others, being the only one left alive, sometimes led to a loneliness so deep it verged on madness. The days made him feel as though everything was lost. The snow had blended everything together, wiping out the existence of everything around him. At some point, he felt as if he were left outside, the entire world in the middle of nature. Even hearing his own voice's echo was difficult. All he needed was to lock eyes with another human. But in that moment, he was pulled into one of the darkest corners of his mind. At that moment, the feeling of despair deepened with every passing hour. The fear came not only from the cold, but also from the mental void. His inner voice, louder than ever, whispered to him pessimistic thoughts. "You can't get out of here. This might be your grave." A person trying to survive only on instinct, striving to find a life beyond mere existence, begins to struggle with themselves. At some point, a person realizes the infinity of the surrounding nature, the air, everything, and gets lost in fear. But something began to change. Every morning when Ivan woke up, he made a different decision than the day before. I must survive today. The cold winds at dawn reminded him of something. Surviving meant not just a physical battle, but a mental one too. When he opened his eyes, he immediately decided to hunt. In that moment, a light had turned on. A door had opened in his mind. Beyond everything, he realized that surviving required mental strength. He knew that taking another step, seizing another opportunity, required patience. Each day, as he fought against nature, he also tried to rediscover the strength within himself. Slowly, he began to accept how much nature tested him every morning. Every moment felt like a battle, but he realized that he could only win this war with his own strength. Hunting times had now become a necessity. The thought that there was so little time left, that he needed to find game to survive, turned into a battle requiring patience. Ivan began to move more carefully and consciously with every hunting opportunity. The ability to be in harmony with nature gave him only a chance to survive. The eyes watching him reminded him that nature required patience and planned movement. One day, perhaps weeks later, he noticed the tracks of a rabbit. Without realizing it, he had carefully followed its tracks for a long time, sometimes stopping, sometimes freezing completely. As he took each step, he carefully observed the silhouette of the body of the prey he was tracking, and suddenly, his heart began to race. But this time it was not just hunger that helped him. His patience in his mind also guided him. Slowly, he approached the area where the rabbit was, and at the right moment, motionless, he shot his target. In that moment, Ivan was given something beyond just winning a hunt. He remembered that he was a strong being. The nature in front of him had tested his patience, but instead of losing, he had once again triumphed in this tough battle. He rediscovered his inner strength and resilience. Now, this small victory would not only give him physical strength, but also mentally empower him once again. The fourth week was a turning point for Ivan. His body was growing weaker, and each step required more and more strength. The muscle power he once had gradually worn out, and every movement now came with fatigue. However, as he pushed beyond his physical limits, his determination to survive became his only support. Every morning when he woke up in the snow, the same thought filled his mind. I must survive today. This thought gave him new energy, providing a reason to take the next step. One morning, after wandering the forest for days without finding any tracks, he noticed something different in the snowy landscape. Beneath the thin layer of snow, something was rising. As he got closer, he saw that it was a half-buried apple tree with roots and branches. The icy ground had not prevented this tree from being covered in snow over time, but the tree had managed to survive in the snow. Ivan began to carefully dig around the roots. Despite the icy conditions, the roots of the apple tree were fresh and full of life. Around the roots, nearly frozen, he found a few apples. The apples were small, but incredibly valuable. In the freezing, cold, finding fruit was almost a miraculous thing. Although the apples tasted bitter, they would provide him with the energy he needed to survive. He immediately ate a few, putting the rest in his pocket to store. This gave him a chance to survive for a little longer. The roots and fruits gave him not only physical strength, but also a glimmer of hope mentally. However, these plants alone weren't enough for him to survive. To truly nourish himself, he needed another source. For the next few days, he sustained himself with the roots and apples, slowly gaining strength. His muscles began to recover a little, and his body hurt less. However, with each passing day, the necessity of hunting became even more critical. His biggest problem was the lack of meat and protein. That morning, Ivan realized something had changed in the forest. His eyes had become accustomed to following every detail and every trace. Finally, in the dark corners of the forest, he spotted the tracks of a rabbit. He began following the rabbit's tracks, becoming more careful and calm with every step. He scanned the area where the rabbit had passed, waiting patiently and watching his prey. This time, Ivan, tested by nature's patience, was waiting for the perfect timing. A few minutes later, he moved closer to where the rabbit was hiding. His heart began to race, but he moved calmly without panic. He took a few more steps, raised his rifle, and pulled the trigger at the right moment. The rabbit fell to the ground. Ivan, shivering from the cold, but also filled with great satisfaction, approached his catch. This not only provided him with food, but also gave him the strength to continue surviving. He immediately cooked a portion of the meat and ate it. Slowly, the taste of the meat reminded him of his former strength, endurance, and determination. He saved a portion for the next day because finding game was becoming harder and harder. Storing some of the meat gave him a guarantee for the future. As darkness fell slowly, Ivan sat in his shelter. While watching the snowy landscape, he realized how different he was from just a few weeks ago. Back then, everything had seemed lost, but now, with small but valuable victories, he was beginning to feel hope again. The roots and apples had given him a start to survive, but hunting the rabbit had given him the strength to do even more. This fourth week not only meant surviving, but also marked a spiritual renewal. Ivan had resisted every hardship nature threw at him, surpassing his physical limits. Now something had become clearer. Hope was as strong as the snow and the cold. By the end of the fifth week, Ivan felt exhausted and worn out. The limits of his body were becoming more and more apparent, and with every step, it seemed as though he was fighting his last battle. His mind had aligned with his survival instincts, focusing solely on the need to survive. He tried to remember how strong he once was, but the strength he had had seemed to have been left behind. Most of the time, he no longer had the strength to even hold on to anything. In this snow-covered barren land, it had become increasingly difficult to track anything. Finding his way, overcoming the despair of being lost, now seemed impossible. Yet something had changed. Ivan realized that his struggle with nature had taken on a meaning beyond mere survival. With each passing day, he had become a part of nature. Every tree, every gust of wind, every snowflake seemed to be telling him something. Something was happening in his mind. Nature had been teaching him that survival wasn't the only way to exist, but that there was also a way to live in peace with it. These 5 weeks had shown him not only how strong he was, but also how he had to submit to the power of nature. One morning, while walking along snow-covered trails, he suddenly heard a faint sound in his ears. At first, he didn't recognize it. But then he sharpened his hearing and listened carefully. It was a scream. At first, he couldn't understand what it was. Filled with fear and confusion, he listened more intently. For a long time, he only heard the rustling of the wind and the crunching of his footsteps in the snow. But the sound came again, this time clearer and more definite. He heard someone calling for help in pain. His survival instincts immediately kicked in. He followed the sound. Moving through snow, ice, and frozen trees, his steps were slow but determined. Even though he was exhausted in that moment, he found the lost hope inside him again. As he moved closer to the source of the sound, he directed his attention to everything around him. For a man who had been alone for days, filling his inner emptiness only with nature, this sound was more than just a scream. It was a call for salvation. After about an hour of challenging walking, as he crossed a snow-covered hill, he saw the silhouette of a small village in the distance, its rooftops covered in snow. This was the exit from a world that seemed lost. He saw traces of people, and eventually he reached the source of the cries. When he arrived at a small, seemingly abandoned house, he found a group of villagers standing in front of the door. They ran toward him. Their eyes were filled with fear and curiosity. For a few seconds, they stared at each other. Then Ivan knelt to the ground and took a final deep breath. The villagers urgently took him to a safe place. In that moment, Ivan began to feel the full weight and coldness of his body. Mentally, he accepted that the test nature had given him was finally over. This entire process had shown him not only his physical strength, but also his inner strength. This struggle for survival had taught him how to exist peacefully with nature, and how even in moments of weakness, a person could remain strong. His vision blurred. For one last time, his mind reflected on how important this struggle had been. Not only for survival, but also for gaining a deep understanding of survival skills. His life, the struggle between life, death, and nature, though a great trial against the harshness of nature, had taught him that survival was not just a physical test, but also a mental and spiritual one. He was treated in the village for a few days. Finally, as a man who had been lost and exhausted but had managed to survive, he realized how important that short journey had been while talking to the villagers. 5 weeks had taught him so much about life. He had understood that surviving, in harmony with nature, was as valuable as survival itself. While resting in a small room in the village, Ivan took another deep breath. One life, one person, could survive alone for such a long time. But salvation came with just a scream, a call for help. And that scream would be a call he would remember for the rest of his life.